And we're really, really welcome, want to welcome again everybody who's in attendance today. It's a very special occasion. It was 100 years ago, officially yesterday, but today is our celebration. 100 years ago, Americans went to war to fight the Great War, and supposedly they'd hoped the war to end all wars, and we know how that turned out. It was on the 11th hour of the 11th month, the 11th day of the 11th month, that they signed the armistice, and of course a year later signed a final agreement that officially ended World War I, and that's what we're here to commemorate. So without further ado, I'd ask that you all please remain standing as we post our, oh, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. Tim has a special letter to read for us. Mr. Tim Smith from the York County Historical Committee is going to read a special letter, immediately after which he reads the letter. We'll ask you all to stand as you're able for the posting of our colors.
Everyone can be seated. As we do our ceremony today, we'd like to again thank everyone for being here. We're going to concentrate on the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, so a lot of the program will be based on that. This is a letter that was written on November 11th of 1918. It was written right after the armistice took place at 11 o'clock on that date. I only hope the soldiers that died for this cause are looking down upon the world today. The whole world owes this moment of real joy to the heroes that are not here to help enjoy it. Captain Charles Normington, 127th Infantry, 32nd Division. And now we'd like to post our colors, if everyone would stand. VFW Post 824.
Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Please join me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance. And for all of our military members, you can salute. Present arms. I
Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Two. Just take the ball and run with it.
Thank you to our veterans for presenting our colors and to Terry Taylor for that beautiful rendition of the national anthem. So we didn't need an orchestra, we had Terry. So everyone could please be seated. As we've been doing our program over the years, we've been doing it based on letters and stories from war, and after a lot of the services in the last few years, it's kind of taken on a life of its own where people will walk up and hand me letters that their ancestors or someone in their family wrote home. And this was given to me after last year's Veterans Day ceremony. This fella, his uncle was a Hellcat flyer in the Second World War. And he had the entire letter, and I took a portion of it, writing home. And it was written home on November 11th of 1945. So it's November 11th. It's a different war. As Dan was saying, the war to end all wars didn't. And we're still sending people out in harm's way today. But he writes home, he says, "Dear folks, you were talking to an old salt, a regular seagoing guy, a sailor boy, and an airplane driver. Been on the high seas now for a number of days, and I'm getting fairly used to the rocking of the ship." Now, 2 weeks after he wrote this letter, he was shot down and was floated for 2 days before he was rescued. So it's nice that these people share these stories with us. Dan's already recognized our guest, but we'd like to recognize, how many of you are veterans? Please stand. Veterans are active duty. We're going to recognize you again, but we want to thank you for your service. Just out of curiosity, how many of you are infantry, Army, Air Force, Marines? No Marines today. Navy, United States Coast Guard. Okay. All right, anyway, thank you, and let's move on with our next letter. During the First World War, the services were segregated, and some of the famous divisions were the 92nd and 93rd Division. This letter was written home by Private Clarence Price of the 93rd Division. They served under the French, so they were given French helmets, and they were tinted a little bit of a blue, and so they became known as the 93rd Division, the Blue Helmet Division, and that became their insignia for their shoulder patch. He writes home, "My dear mother, I've been living in 2 towns since I've been here, but I don't know the name of either one of them. The people I can't understand at all." He's in France. "I've not heard how Archie is getting along. We left him one of those little towns with the Red Cross people. He got his hand hurt. I was just 13 days and 13 nights on the great ocean. You remember one time when I was home how we had argued about this. Some said it took 6 days and some said another thing. Well, it took me 13 days and 13 nights, but we still came over here quickly enough." Clarence Price, 93rd Division. And this program is going to be based on the men from York County and Poquoson that served in the Great War. Some of them returned, most of them returned, some of them did not. Some of them passed away. You know, the Spanish flu epidemic hit in 1918 and decimated a lot of the troops that were here and in ports. So bear with me. This is a panoramic of the 80th Division, Company G, 318th Infantry. This group had about 100 men in the unit. 25 of them were from this area. And they were what they call the National Army. The National Army were the divisions that were drafted. So they end up actually going overseas before the National Guard. You had your regular divisions, which were the low number. You had your National Guard divisions, which for Virginia was the 29th Division. Then you had your National Armies, the first draftees. In this case, when we think of draftees, we think of the 17, 18, 19-year-olds. But during the First World War, the first draft were 21, 22, up to 27, 28-year-olds. So when these guys went into the service, they'd been out in the workforce and were pulled out and sent to Camp Lee, and they actually constructed Camp Lee. They were infantry. If you've been infantry, you know you get details, or some of their details, and if you've ever been to Camp Lee, it was a large part of it was an orchard. Well, they literally pulled apple trees up with manpower. They put 300 or 400 guys with ropes on trees and pulled them out by the roots, just using people to get them up. And this is part of a panoramic. It's 4 photographs altogether. The 80th Division image was taken at the end of the war, and one of the guys I'll show you later is not in this because he is killed in action on the day before the armistice on November 10th. This is a company out of, a group out of the Company G group, and these all are York County men. They sat and had their image done. We know who some of them are based on other photographs. The man that's sitting directly in front of the cornstalk is Wilton Wainwright, and he's the guy that loses his life on November 10th. He's buried at Tabernacle Church in Poquoson. This is Mr. Pettit, William Pettit, and he wasn't active duty. His job, he ran the remount depot in Newport News. During the war, before we got involved, and even after we got involved, we were actually selling horses to the Allies in Europe. And Newport News, downtown, they had a huge remount depot, and I don't have the photograph of that in here, but it's just acres and acres of horses. And Mr. Pettit, who was a York County citizen, was the manager and foreman of the whole depot. He lived up near what we know as the Pottery area, and he lived on Lot 1, number 1 in York County. This is a photograph of some of the sailors when they moved part of the fleet from Norfolk to the York River. Someone went on board and took a photograph. It was, I think there were 18 ships, 14 or 18 ships were moved over, and it was supposed to be kept hush-hush. And all these sailors came ashore, and a lot of them are camped at what we know as the Coast Guard station now. So the Navy was there before the Coast Guard was there. Irving Melvin Opheim, Marines 5th Regiment, he was from the Norge area of York County. For some reason, a group from Norge, which bordered James City County and York County, decided they were going to enlist in the Marines instead of going in the Army. So we can document 7 from that little community going in the Marines, and 5 of them don't return. They're lost at the Belleau Wood action and at Meuse, Argonne. I went up there to get these photographs, and this one lady who was like the historian, the local historian lady of that area, brought all these images in for us. And we were able to add them. He's on the monument out front. The 2nd Division consisted of 4 regiments. They were large divisions, and the only Marines that were in Europe were the 2 regiments of Marines attached to the 2nd Division. So you had 2 Army regiments and 2 Marine regiments. And a little side note, how many of you have heard of a Model T being called a Tin Lizzie? That term? That comes from the fact that when the Marines got over there, this lady in New York, well-to-do, wealthy lady, decided to donate a Model T truck to the Marines over there for their transport, just 1 truck. So it gets over there, and her name was Lizzie. So they nicknamed it the Model T. They called it the Lizzie. So that's where that nickname comes from. Tin Lizzie. This is Joseph Knofton, also from Norge area. He loses his life, and we have a copy of the telegram that was sent home to his mother when, or to his parents when he's lost in action during the Belleau Wood action. George Clopton, he's just over the line. He kind of part of his properties in York County, and most of it's in James City County. He's another one in the same group of Marines from Norge, loses his life overseas. This is Austin Carmines. He's 80th Division from Poquoson. He lived well up into the mid-'80s, and Austin was in the Signal Corps as attached to this 80th Division we showed you earlier. The divisions then had about 20,000 men, so they were huge. This is another photograph of Austin. John Tyler Crockett from Seaford. He was in the 80th Division, but he was in a different regiment, 317th Company B. Photographed with his wife. These were usually done at Camp Lee. James Diggs actually started in Matthews, ends up in Poquoson, York County. So all the Diggs from the area are from his family. We have a couple of photographs of James Diggs. Haven't been able to determine what unit he was in, but obviously he was in there. Harry Hopkins and his wife, and she's in a Navy auxiliary uniform. He served with the machine gun battalions, and if you know anything about the First World War, the machine guns, it became a big thing, and they were just devastating. They just didn't have machine gun units. They had battalions of them where they were forming up for this trench warfare. So we have a number of these guys that served in machine gun units. Charlie Chesser, U.S. Navy, First World War. And we found that only one of them is his brother. The other 2 are just friends that wanted to be in the photograph with him because he's in uniform. So you're always learning about these things once you get them. Henry Earl Freeman. Freeman family is big in the York County, Poquoson area, U.S. Navy, First World War. We at our boatyard, we hauled a boat for his nephew, who was also Henry Earl Freeman. And, but we always knew him as Fuzzy. I didn't know his real name for years. He was just Captain Fuzzy. So they asked, well, his real name's Henry. I said, nobody's ever told me that, you know. This is my relative who's in the First World War. No, I'm just kidding. This is a postcard sent home by one of the soldiers talking about how great being in the Army is, and anybody that's been in the service can identify with it, I think. But we always show it and make up a story about our cousin who was cross-eyed and got on the wrong train and ended up at the wrong camp in California. And he was successful because no, the Germans never took California. So. Jack Jones, this image was actually taken at Langley Field, now Langley Air Force Base, just after the war. But his unit and Jack Jones was in the war. And this particular bomber is interesting because it's a B-2, and they were the bombers that Billy Mitchell was in charge of. And they took them out and proved the point that they could sink a ship with a plane. And of course, Billy Mitchell ends up getting court-martialed about it, but they were successful. So he was, we believe, living with someone in Poquoson at the time, the image, because the image is in a Poquoson family. Dick Huggett, 318th, 80th Division. His brother was living when we gathered these images of Dick and his brother Joe, and he's in the panoramic we'll show at the end of the image too. Part of that Company G group. What's interesting about this group of men, since they already knew each other when they go to Camp Lee, you know, they're already running around together. There's one guy in the group, John Forrest, and John is the good poker player. So anytime the guys wanted to come home, John would give them the money to come home to the Lee Hall train depot so they could get home based on John Forrest's poker money. This is Marvin Lindsay. He ran buy boats after the war. He's another one in that Company G. He's also in that group shot that we showed earlier. Again, all these guys knew each other. Pete Lawson, Company G. Pete writes a letter home, actually a postcard home to his sister. And he gets to Camp Lee. He's there about 3 days. He's in the first draft. He writes a postcard home, and he writes it just like you would talk back then. It's not formal English. He says, "Dear sis," he said, "things is a lots better today than they was yesterday. Nothing to do and a plenty to eat, Pete." And he became a company cook. So, Wilton Wainwright, he's the fellow sitting in front of the corn stalk that doesn't return and gets killed on November 10th of 1918. And before he leaves, he gives his niece one of these big pennies from the turn of the century and tells her he'll pick it up when he comes back. Of course, he never comes back. So, Willie Bradshaw. Willie gets wounded. He's Company G also. He gets wounded in no man's land, and my father said you could you almost put your hand in the wound place in his back where he got hit by shrapnel. He gets left out in no man's land, so this other man who's in the company goes out and brings him back, Sam Freeman, who gets wounded also. For years, we didn't have a photograph of Sam Freeman. We knew one existed. And I would go talk to the family about the image, and they said, "Oh, yeah, you know, the older fellow, yeah, we probably got one around here somewhere." So earlier in the spring of this year, I was sitting in choir practice at my church and talking about these images, and the girl in front of me, she said, "Well, we've got one of Henry Freeman," which was this Navy sailor, "and we've got one of his brother, too." I said, "Sam Freeman?" She said, "I don't know." She said, "It says 3/18 something on it." So we had Sam Freeman's image, and Frank Carmines, who helped collect some of these images, always said there's got to be one of him somewhere because he was well known. He's decorated for saving Willie Bradshaw. He gets wounded doing it. And then Willie Bradshaw would always brag about him and say, you know, George Washington, he was a great man, but he wasn't as good a man as Sam Freeman because Sam Freeman pulled me out of no man's land. So it's all perspective, I guess. And here's Sam Freeman. We have a uniform image, but it's not a very clear one, so we need to get. So a hardy-looking guy. And it was Sam Jones Freeman because you see these historical names get used a lot throughout history. Winnie Forrest, also in that same company. Now, another story about these guys, just before they ship them overseas, they come home through the Lee Hall train depot, and you've got the Naval Mining Depot then, now in the Naval Weapons Station. You've got a Navy base with Marine Guards at the gates. So you've got these Marine Guards, and Pete Lawson, Winnie Forrest, and Marius Hogg from over what we know as the Guinea section of Gloucester. He's in that company. You know, you got all these local guys in there. Well, they park in the gate entrance and block the gate. So the Marine Guard goes there and taps Marius Hogg and says, "You can't park there. You're blocking our gate. You can't do that." He said, "Oh, I'll get it in a minute. I'll move it in a minute." And a few months later, the Marine Guard goes and taps him again. He said, "You got to move the automobile. You can't park there. You got to move it." He said, "I get to it in a minute." And he goes on talking to Pete and Winnie Forrest. And then he comes back a third time, Marine Guard, and he said, "If you don't move the automobile, we're going to move it ourselves. We'll push it out of the way." And Marius Hogg said, "We ain't afraid of you and the whole damn Marine Corps." And Pete Lawson tapped him on the shoulder. He said, Marius, he said, we're right behind you, but I think we're biting off a big chew. So, so the three of them against the entire Marine Corps. This is Benny Leverson. He's also from Norge. Jay Leverson and his family is the one that helped us get a lot of these images of these guys. He's another one that doesn't return. So you think about a little community. Norge is still not a big community. You think about the little community of Norge and losing 5 to 6 men that we know of lost in action and how devastating that can be. This is Willie Banks. Willie is in the 811th Pioneer Regiment. He's buried at Cary's Chapel Church on the way into Poquoson in the Tab area. And Willie survives the war. He's wearing his discharge stripe, which is the stripe that's pointed up on his sleeve. He's got a service stripe at the bottom of the sleeve, so showing a minimum of 6 months overseas. I know they were almost 12 months. They were almost to the point where he could have gotten 2 service stripes. We also know which ship they went over on. Again, the service was segregated. The 811 Pioneers go over, and they're constructing railroad tracks. They're just doing all the work of this, and they're attached to the 8th Division. So Willie, Joe Fox, who I think is buried, might be buried at the Masonic Cemetery, Sherman. But anyway, these guys all see each other because they're off in the county. Even though they're different units, they end up running into each other while they're deployed. Willie survives the war, but he gets tuberculosis while he's over there and passes away in 1922. Just a very, very fine man. This is Joseph Huggett, Dick Huggett's brother. I think he gets sent into the 80th, and he gets sent. A lot of these guys in the early divisions get sent as replacements. So he goes over as a replacement. He's wounded in action. He's another one, survives the war, but comes home, and there's this bus that runs from Poquoson to Hampton that would run people in the 1910s and 20s. If you wanted to go to Hampton, you got the bus and went, because most people didn't have cars. And the bus gets hit by a train. It stalls on the train track, and about 17 or 18 people are killed. Anyway, Joseph is off, but he goes back on the bus to rescue the children that are on there, and he dies on the bus. So, Grady Montgomery from Seaford, Virginia, 32nd Division. He gets sent and attached to a National Guard division, but it's not a Virginia one. Luther Ironmonger gets sent in as a replacement to the 6th Division. Taylor Ironmonger. Taylor is, yes.
No kidding.
Yes, he is. Taylor, all these ironmongers are related. So, little local history there. Taylor Ironmonger, MP 5th Division. He's another one gets sent as a replacement. His daughter has a lot of things that he brought home from the war, also from the Seaford area. This is another one of Taylor.
Taylor, brother of the other guy?
No, they're cousins. Yeah, cousins, yeah. Yeah, you got about 10 names in York County at the time, you know, so. I'm one of them, so I can. We think this is Fred Firth, 116th. He's the only guy we've got that designates to the National Guard Division, the 116th at the time. National Guard Division, 116th, we're still part of that. And we base this on another image of him. This is Fred Firth, we know, 116th Infantry, 29th Division. They get over there right at the end of the war, so they don't see much action. Wilton Inslee sent over as a replacement to the 4th Division. And he's part of the local Insleys, but they spelled their name with an E where everybody else did with an I. This is another one of Wilton Inslee, 4th Division. Harry Wainwright, at first when the image came up, they thought it might be the Harry Wainwright who was in the Navy, Harry Rowe Wainwright, who dies at Portsmouth Naval Hospital from the Spanish flu. But once we start looking at the image, of course it's an Army type of uniform, and when you enlarge it, it's got aviation collar disc on it. So he's probably stationed at Langley, but he is a local Wainwright. And at the bottom of the picture, it says something about this is the pretty man or something like that. Somebody wrote a note on there. So he must have been a real go-getter. Anyway, it's Linwood Parker. He's an engineers battalion attached to the 8th Division. He's a Seaford resident. Robert Reed Holloway, he gets sent as a replacement to the 2nd Division. So he's in one of the 2 Army regiments that are part of the 2nd. You know, the Marines had 2 regiments in that division, and the Army had 2 regiments, and he gets killed in action during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. This is, again, Wilton Wainwright that gets killed in action during the Meuse-Argonne. It's the last major offensive, and that's where the Americans took most of their casualties. Benjamin Evans Wainwright, he gets wounded in action. He's kind of the tab area. Survives the war, comes home, and he's buried over in Norfolk. Ends up moving to Norfolk to work at Norfolk Naval Yard. Floyd Diego White, he gets killed in action. He's from Seaford. He's one of the guys who gets sent into the machine gun battalions, 26th Division. Sam Freeman, that we talked about earlier, that saves the guy. This is a huge plaque, and what they would do is they would, French would present these as wound honors to the men that were wounded in action. And that's where she saw the 318th Infantry. I don't know if it's, yeah, you can see it up there, Company G, 318th Infantry. This is Harry Rowe Wainwright. We know there's an image of him. We don't have it, but this is where he dies, U.S. Navy at the Portsmouth Naval Hospital. Decatur Carmines, he gets deployed to the 3rd Division. He sees an awful lot of action. We have an image of him taken 2 years before the war. He looks like a teenager, and you can see how the war's worn on him in the face. After the war, he really never came out of the house much. He stayed home. He was gassed and wounded during the war with the 3rd. And he was in the action that became known as where they got their moniker, the Rock of the Marne, the Marne Offensive. This is an unknown Poquoson waterman returning home. He's on the boat. Yesterday, when I did part of the program, we talked about him possibly being a World War II veteran, and we now know he's a World War I veteran, so we're still trying to identify him. But he's got 3 service stripes, which means 18 months overseas, which is very unusual for the World War I area. So Amy was still working on this. This is the last image in the series, and this is the 80th Division at the end, and the fellow seated 4th in on the front row is Dick Huggett. His brother pointed him out to me when I went to see the image. This is the 8th Division marching in Richmond at the end of the war. When they return home, it's their victory parade. The 80th had men from Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia in it, and the 318th was almost all Virginians. This is a 318th member from Fox Hill. I've got the name somewhere, and I can't find it, so I've got to get with the fellow that let me photograph it. He's in the engineers, and they're doing grave markings in Belgium at the end of the war, and with some of the most beautiful cemeteries we have. And this is the street right out here. So if you go out and look, you see Grace Church, the house on the left of the street, and the water tower is, of course, no longer there. But it's interesting that we do the program here and have a photograph of a street right outside here. I don't think the balloon's out there anymore either, is it? I haven't seen it lately anyway. At this point, I'd like to do another letter from the First World War. And it was written on November 11th, right at the last day of the war, by Sergeant Walter Lockhart. It said, the same flares last night would have meant we are falling back or we are advancing. Tonight mean the war is over, and Fritz is as happy as we are. At this point, we'd like to recognize our veterans. We're going to run a little piece of music called Letters from Home. And as the music's playing, we'd like the veterans to come up forward, turn and face everybody that's still seated. So we can cue the music. Everyone can be seated, and I don't know who to ask to leave first, the Submariner or the Air Force. You know, who goes? Who's the first people out? Or the infantry guys are raising their hands? Which service were you in?
Air Force.
Air Force.
Actually, I think it's the cargo handling battalion.
Thank you. It's always nice to see all of our veterans out here. At this time, we're going to get ready to lay our wreaths. We've got 3 groups laying wreaths today. This is another letter that I was handed a few years back by someone that was here at the ceremony. And it was actually part of a telegram Admiral Halsey sent out after the Guadalcanal action. So I'm going to read it as a telegram, the way it was sent, February 1943. To the superb officers and men on land, on sea, in the air, and under the sea, who have performed such magnificent feats for our country in the past few days, stop. You have written your names in the golden letters of history and won the undying gratitude of your countrymen, stop. God bless each and every one of you, stop. To the glorious dead, hail heroes, rest with God. Signed, Halsey. We've got 3 groups presenting wreaths for our ceremony. I'd like to have them come up now. The first group is Comte de Grasse chapter, National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And we're always glad to have you folks here. I hear you've got one of the buildings here on Main Street, right? So anything you bring into county's got to go through the custom house. You have to see them. Laws haven't changed. Our next wreath is placed by the Disabled American Veterans, Chapter 13. Terry is always a great supporter, as is DAV Chapter 13 of our events. And our third wreath is to be placed by the Morehouse Society Children of the American Revolution. We're glad to have them participate with us as well. It's so important for our youth to know our history. At this time, we'd like to have everyone please stand for taps. Everyone may be seated. The next letters, November 11th, 1918. And this was written by a German soldier, Erich Remarque, who you will have known, who wrote the All Quiet on the Western Front. He was writing before the war. He ends up getting drafted by the German service. It goes into the 2nd Division, German Army Reserve, 15th Infantry Reserve Unit. And after the war, his writings, which were classic to the story of All Quiet on the Western Front, had to do with the horrors he saw in the trench warfare. And at some point, the Germans in the 1930s banned his books and burned them, because they were against the policies that they were pushing at the time. But he's very poignant in what he writes. November 11th, 1918, the war is over, and in an hour we will leave. We will never have to come back here. A light fog curls over the ground, and we can clearly see the lines of pits and trenches. These elements of a frightening world and an unforgiving life. In an hour's time, everything will have disappeared, and disappeared to the point that one might never believe it never existed. And another fellow writes, and this is after the war, it's January 2nd, 1919. Dear Mother, I got my final pay and discharge yesterday, and if you'd seen me beating it towards New York State, why, I went so fast my shadow was a half mile behind me. Cussing and falling down because it couldn't keep up with me. Warren Spencer, 78th Division. So how many of you had that as you got out of the service? You were that much ready to go with the shadow following. At this time, we'd like to retire the colors. I'd like to ask our color guard to come up. And remain standing. This last letter is actually an email I was sent. I was trying to get a veteran I knew, a Vietnam War veteran, to come to our programs. And good friend, helicopter pilot in Vietnam. So I said, sent him an email. I said, you ought to come out to our programs. You know, you're a veteran. And he's very active. He was very active with his veterans group, with his helicopter units. And he wrote back, and he's passed away now, so that's why I felt like I could read the letter. Tim, thanks for the invite, but I usually spend Memorial Day at home with my ghost. I guess that's selfish, not going out to honor all who served. Staying home and honoring for a few, but you know, they are my few. And one of the pieces that we always, or not always, but have read many times because it's so much a part of Veterans Day. It is the soldier, but when he wrote it, he meant airmen and submariners and Navy and Air Force and Coast Guard and everyone. But it is the soldier, not the minister, who has given us freedom of religion. It is the soldier, not the reporter, who has given us freedom of the press. It is the soldier, not the poet, who has given us freedom of speech. It is the soldier, not the campus organizer, who has given us freedom to protest. It is the soldier, not the lawyer, who has given us the right to a fair trial. It is the soldier, not the politician, who has given us the right to vote. It is the soldier who salutes the flag, who serves beneath the flag, and whose coffin is draped by the flag, who allows the protester to burn the flag. On behalf of the York County Historical Committee, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out, taking the time today. I know it's been a busy weekend with all the World War I celebrations and things going on. I'd like to thank VFW Post 824. They're always fantastic. Chapter 13, Disabled American Veterans, the Comte de Grasse chapter, National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution. That's a long thing to say there. The Morehouse Society, Children of the American Revolution. Our RTs weren't able to be with us today because the kids are in school with makeup days from Hurricane Florence. And all the other groups that have supported us in everything we've done, especially the Historical Committee that come out and do so much to preserve history for York County. Thank you. Appreciate you coming out.